Being a delivery boy may sound simple to some, just a young man on a scooter or an old van carrying boxes from one doorstep to another, exchanging greetings, grabbing signatures, and rushing off to the next address. But what nobody ever talks about, and what nobody ever prepares you for, is the chilling truth that when you spend your nights driving down endless black roads and knocking on doors that seem to swallow the light around them, you open yourself up to things far darker and older than any tired human face you expect to meet. Things that watch you from the woods. Things that know your name before you even park your van. Things that you unknowingly invite to follow you when you don't obey the old rules. The locals are too afraid to even speak about unless they absolutely have to. And in my case, the truth about what it really meant to be a delivery boy in a forgotten town in rural Minnesota was something so horrifying, so paralyzingly dreadful, that if you want to understand the real nightmare I fell into, if you want to find out what was waiting for me behind those houses and under those trees and what those packages really carried, you'll have to stay with me all the way to the end. Because once you hear the rules I was forced to follow just to stay alive, once you understand what I faced out there, you'll realize that sometimes the most terrifying job in the world is simply knocking on the wrong door. It all started when I answered a job posting that seemed too good to be true, a desperate ad stuck between lost dog flyers and pawn shop coupons on a rusty old bulletin board outside a rotting diner. The paper fluttering weakly in the cold wind, promising good pay, flexible hours, and a company vehicle. Something that sounded like salvation for someone like me who had no family nearby, no friends to warn me, and no idea of the things that slithered just out of sight in the endless woods that surrounded the tiny town of Renfield. I showed up at the address listed, an ancient brick building at the end of a gravel road nobody bothered to plow anymore. And inside, I met a wiry, hollow-eyed man who introduced himself only as Mr. Granger, a man whose voice cracked like dry leaves as he told me to sit down, his trembling hands passing across the desk, a worn leather folder that smelled faintly of mildew, and something far worse, something coppery and sharp that made my stomach turn before I even touched it. "You'll need to understand the rules if you want to survive here," Mr. Granger said, his thin lips barely moving, his watery eyes darting to the boarded-up windows as if he was afraid of who might be listening. And when he opened the folder, revealing a single sheet of paper covered in jagged handwriting that looked almost clawed into the surface, he tapped it twice with a yellowed finger and said, "Read them, memorize them, obey them, or don't come crying to me when you find out what's waiting for you out there." The first rule was written at the very top, the ink darker and heavier than the rest, as if whoever had written it had pressed down so hard with the pen that they almost tore through the paper itself. And it said, "If you see a man standing in the middle of the road wearing a burlap sack over his head, no matter how much he waves or how desperately he shouts, do not, under any circumstance, stop the vehicle or make eye contact. Keep driving and do not look back." Before I could ask, Mr. Granger rasped out, "You'll see him sooner or later. Everyone does. It's not a man anymore, not really. And if you stop for him, you'll wish you hadn't." My hands were already starting to sweat as I read the second rule, my mouth going dry when my eyes landed on the words. "If you arrive at a house where all the lights are off, but the front door is wide open, you must place the package on the doorstep. Knock exactly 3 times and then leave immediately without stepping inside. If you hear your name being called from inside the house, run and do not answer." When I looked up from the paper, Mr. Granger's face was pale and damp, and he whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "They know your name before you even get there. They want you to come in, but if you do, there's no coming back." My skin was crawling now, every instinct in my body telling me to walk away, to leave that cursed building and never look back. But something stronger, maybe stupidity, maybe desperation, kept me glued to the cracked vinyl chair as my eyes slid down to the third rule, which seemed somehow worse than the first 2. If you hear footsteps behind you while walking back to the van, you must not turn around or acknowledge them. Get into the vehicle as fast as you can, lock the doors, and start the engine. If the engine does not start immediately, close your eyes and do not open them until you are at least 1 mile away. Mr. Granger didn't say anything this time, just stared at me, his mouth pressed into a thin, grim line, as if he was remembering something he wished he could forget, something that still haunted him when he tried to sleep. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my ears as I forced myself to read the fourth rule, my stomach twisting into knots at the cruel simplicity of it. Never, under any circumstances, deliver a package to a house with a black wreath on the door. If you see one, leave the package in the mailbox and drive away without touching the doorknob or stepping onto the porch. If you hear crying coming from inside, do not investigate. Mr. Granger finally spoke again, his voice little more than a hoarse croak as he said, "They're mourning something you don't want to see, and if you interrupt them, they'll never let you leave." By now, every rational part of me was screaming to run, to tear up the paper and throw it in his face. But it was too late, because my eyes had already fallen to the final rule, the one that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up and my gut twist into icy knots. When the road splits into 3 paths and you are unsure which way to go, always take the middle path. No matter what you hear coming from the left, no matter what you see flickering on the right, take the middle path and do not stop until you are far away, because the other 2 are not meant for the living. I looked up at Mr. Granger then, and for the first time, I realized that he wasn't just giving me a list of precautions. He was giving me a warning, a desperate plea from a man who had seen too much and survived by the thinnest of margins, a man who knew that whatever was lurking in the woods and houses and broken roads of Renfield didn't care about good intentions or ignorance, only about hunger and fear. "You still want the job?" Mr. Granger asked, his voice breaking as he slid a battered set of van keys across the desk toward me. And somehow, despite the cold sweat on my back and the pounding terror in my chest, I found myself nodding, sealing my fate with a single, trembling breath as the shadows pressed tighter against the boarded windows and the night outside deepened into something thick and heavy and full of unseen eyes. The instant my fingers closed around the battered keys lying on the scarred wooden desk, a coldness seeped up through the metal, as if the van itself knew the horror that awaited beyond the weak reach of the flickering fluorescent light overhead. And as I stood there, unable to tear my gaze away from the greasy black windows that seemed to breathe with every gust of wind outside, Mr. Granger rose stiffly from his chair, his bones creaking audibly in the suffocating silence, and without looking at me, he muttered, "The van's outside. You'll find tonight's deliveries already packed in the back. And remember, boy, once you start, you can't stop, not until the last package is dropped, no matter what happens." The door to the office groaned in protest as I pushed it open, and stepping into the night was like stepping into the mouth of something vast and waiting, the darkness so thick and heavy that my cheap flashlight barely punched a hole through it, casting a thin, shaking beam that only seemed to make the shadows squirm and crawl more violently at the edges of my vision. And parked crookedly by the curb was a rusted white delivery van, its paint peeling like dead skin, its windows cloudy with grime, and the dull glow of a single cracked taillight blinking feebly like the last heartbeat of a dying animal. Sliding behind the wheel, I tried not to gag at the stench of mildew and old wet earth that filled the cab, my hands trembling as I shoved the key into the ignition, the engine coughing and sputtering before roaring to life with a noise that sounded far too much like a scream. And when I flicked on the headlights, they revealed nothing but the churning fog and the twisted skeletal outlines of trees lining the narrow road that slithered away into the waiting woods. Clutching the list of addresses Mr. Granger had shoved into my jacket pocket, I squinted at the first one, my heart dropping when I realized it lay on the far side of town, past the abandoned rail yard and into the deep country where even the locals refused to drive after dark. But the thought of staying still in that parking lot, of letting the things in the shadows catch up to me before I even started, was somehow worse than whatever lay waiting ahead. So I ground my teeth, jammed the van into gear, and rumbled forward into the suffocating blackness. The gravel crunched and popped beneath the van's balding tires as I left the broken street lamps of Renfield behind, the fog swallowing the world outside, until all I could see was the ghostly gray tunnel carved out by the weak beams of my headlights. And every so often, I would catch glimpses of things moving just beyond the trees, shapes too large and too fluid to be deer. Shapes that seemed to pause when I looked their way before melting back into the darkness with a slithering grace that made my skin crawl and my hands clamp tighter around the steering wheel. After what felt like an eternity of grinding terror, the first house appeared, a sagging, two-story ruin, half choked by wild vines and leaning at an angle that made it seem moments away from collapse. Its front yard little more than a swampy patch of mud dotted with broken toys, and something that looked disturbingly like the remnants of tiny weathered gravestones. And as I rolled to a stop, squinting through the fogged windshield, my stomach turned over in cold horror. Because although the porch light was smashed and every window was dark, the front door gaped open like a mouth frozen in a silent scream. I froze, every word of the second rule roaring through my mind in Mr. Granger's ragged voice. Place the package on the doorstep, knock 3 times, and leave immediately without stepping inside. And my body felt like it had turned to lead as I forced myself to grab the small brown parcel off the passenger seat. The paper rough and damp under my shaking hands, and stumbled up the cracked walkway toward the yawning darkness beyond the door. The air grew colder with every step, thickening until it felt like I was walking through invisible webs that clung to my skin and tugged at my clothes. And by the time I reached the sagging porch, my breath was coming in shallow gasps, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might shatter my ribs. But I didn't hesitate, not when I remembered the look in Mr. Granger's eyes, the desperate, haunted look of a man who knew exactly what would happen if I disobeyed. I set the package down carefully on the rotten wooden boards, the thud of it echoing far too loudly in the suffocating quiet, and with a hand that barely seemed to belong to me, I balled my fist and knocked. Once, twice, 3 times, each rap sounding weaker than the last, as if the house itself was swallowing the sound before it could escape. I turned immediately, my boots slipping on the slick moss that coated the porch, and as I stumbled back toward the van, I heard it. A voice, low and musical and horribly familiar, calling my name from the blackness inside the house, sweet and pleading in a tone that scraped against my mind like broken glass. And although every fiber of my being screamed to look to see who or what was beckoning me, I kept my eyes locked on the van, sprinting the last few steps and wrenching open the door with a strength born of pure animal panic. Slamming the door shut, I locked it with shaking fingers, shoving the key into the ignition so hard I almost snapped it. And as the engine roared to life, I dared a glance back at the porch through the rearview mirror. But there was nothing there, just the empty, sagging doorway and the heavy, suffocating fog that seemed to pulse with silent, malevolent laughter. I peeled out of the driveway, gravel spraying in all directions as I barreled back onto the narrow road, the headlights carving a frantic path through the mist, and it wasn't until I had put at least a mile between myself and that nightmare house that I realized I was still gasping for breath, my whole body trembling with the aftershock of the encounter. And deep in the pit of my stomach, a new fear began to bloom, because I knew, somehow, that was only the beginning, and the road ahead held things far worse than an open door and a whispering voice. Gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, I shoved the crumpled list of deliveries into the cup holder, my eyes darting between the darkness ahead and the shadows clawing at the corners of the road. And somewhere far off in the woods, something let out a long, keening howl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up, a sound full of hunger and despair and something else, something intelligent. And I realized with a sickening lurch that the night was far from over, and the worst was still to come. The howl still echoed faintly in the cold air as I pressed harder on the gas pedal, my heart hammering in my ears so loudly it nearly drowned out the groaning protests of the old van's engine. And the headlights stretched only a pathetic few feet ahead, barely cutting into the black fog that seemed to grow thicker, heavier, almost as if it had substance and purpose, wrapping itself around the vehicle in a suffocating embrace that made every instinct inside me scream to turn around, to abandon the deliveries, to flee back to the relative safety of town and never set foot on these cursed roads again. But the crumpled list in my cup holder felt like an anchor dragging me deeper into nightmare. each address another step into the jaws of something waiting patiently just out of sight. The second delivery was marked on a crooked country lane that didn't appear on the GPS, a road that branched off into the woods like a bony finger beckoning me closer. And as I turned the wheel and felt the tires crunch over uneven gravel, I caught myself glancing into the trees, half expecting to see faces peering out at me. Faces twisted and wrong. But there was only darkness, thick and oily, and the occasional whisper of movement that made my skin crawl and my throat tighten with a terror so pure it left me breathless. I drove slowly, the van bouncing and rattling over potholes and stones, until at last a structure loomed out of the mist. A small, crooked house, leaning precariously to one side, its paint long since stripped away by wind and rain, its windows broken and gaping like black eyes. And although a faint porch light glowed with a sickly yellow pulse, casting long, twitching shadows across the ground, my stomach dropped as I spotted something hanging from the door. A black wreath, limp and rotting, tangled with brittle dead vines that swayed even though there was no breeze. The fourth rule screamed through my mind with brutal clarity. Never, under any circumstances, deliver a package to a house with a black wreath on the door. And every hair on my body stood on end as I forced myself to stop the van a good 20 feet from the crumbling porch, my fingers fumbling to find the small, battered mailbox perched on a rusted metal pole, half swallowed by tall, withered grass. The package for this address sat mocking me on the seat beside me, wrapped in damp brown paper and tied with a grimy length of string that looked suspiciously stained, and my hands shook so badly as I picked it up that I nearly dropped it, a thin whine of panic rising in my throat as I shoved open the creaking door of the van and stepped into the cold, fetid night air. Every step toward the mailbox felt like moving through syrup, my legs sluggish and weak as if the very ground beneath me wanted to pull me down into it. And the house seemed to watch me, the broken windows shifting subtly, impossibly, as if adjusting their empty gaze to track my every move. And from somewhere deep inside the structure, I heard it. A faint, heart-wrenching sobbing, the sound of a woman weeping in utter despair, each choked breath pulling at something primal and compassionate inside me, something that begged to help, to comfort, to save. I bit down on my tongue so hard I tasted blood, using the sharp pain to anchor myself as I shoved the package into the mailbox with a force that nearly ripped it off its hinges, spinning on my heel and sprinting back to the van with all the strength my trembling body could muster. And just as I slammed the door shut and locked it, the crying escalated into a desperate, ragged scream, a scream that somehow came from inside my own ears, vibrating against my bones and clawing at my mind with filthy, unseen hands. Jamming the key into the ignition, I twisted hard, praying, begging, and for one horrifying moment, the engine sputtered uselessly, a wet, choking sound that made my heart seize with terror. But then with a roar that felt like salvation itself, the van lurched to life, and I stomped on the gas, tearing away from that cursed house so fast that the wheels spat up clouds of gravel and mud. And in the rearview mirror, I saw something staggering out onto the porch. Something tall and thin and impossibly twisted, its arms too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle as it watched me flee into the mist. I didn't dare blink until the black wreath house was swallowed by the darkness behind me, my body shaking so violently I could hardly keep the van steady on the crumbling road. And as I reached for the list of deliveries with numb fingers, a sick realization punched the breath from my lungs. There were still 3 more addresses to go, 3 more chances for the night to devour me. And every rule Mr. Granger had given me felt like a noose tightening around my neck, pulling me deeper into a nightmare from which there would be no waking. The third address lay farther out, past a crossroads where the map showed no names, only 3 ragged lines splitting the road into 3 dark mouths. And as I hurtled onward, the trees thickened and closed in tighter, the mist growing heavier and darker, until the headlights seemed barely able to penetrate the wall of blackness ahead. And somewhere on the edge of hearing, there came the sound of footsteps running parallel to the van, heavy and urgent, too fast, too close. But no matter how desperately I tried to ignore it, my eyes flicked instinctively toward the trees, and for a heartbeat, I saw it. A man-shaped figure, sprinting beside me in the woods, its burlap-sacked head bobbing grotesquely with every stride. Rule 1 detonated in my mind like a bomb. Do not stop. Do not look back. And with a strangled cry, I pressed harder on the gas, the engine screaming in protest as the van hurtled toward the fork in the road, the middle path barely distinguishable through the swirling mist and darkness. And from the left fork, a low moaning drifted out, thick with pain and pleading, while from the right, a flickering golden light beckoned warmly, promising safety, promising escape. My hands trembled on the wheel as I wrestled with instinct and terror, but Mr. Granger's grim words burned into my mind like brands. Take the middle path, no matter what. And clenching my teeth so hard my jaw cracked audibly, I wrenched the wheel toward the center, the van bouncing and skidding over broken asphalt as the other two roads fell away behind me. And as I sped forward into the endless black, the moaning and the golden light shriveled into silence, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the steady thud of my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back, not even once, because deep down I knew that if I did, I would see something behind me, something so hideous, so wrong, that it would tear my mind apart before my body even had a chance to scream. The van rattled violently as it tore along the crumbling middle road, the tires slipping on patches of loose gravel and unseen potholes that jolted the steering wheel in my death grip hands. And even though I forced myself to keep my eyes fixed rigidly ahead, the darkness on either side of the narrow lane seemed to pulse and shift, as though alive with countless unseen things pacing me just out of sight, their invisible fingers brushing against the edges of reality, reaching for me with a hunger so palpable I could almost taste the sourness of it on my tongue. Somewhere deep in the dense woods to my left, there came a sudden, brutal crash, the sound of trees splintering, of something massive and wrathful forcing its way through the forest. And although my body screamed at me to glance over, to just see what nightmare was tearing through the undergrowth, I clenched my jaw until I felt something pop in my ear, knowing that one look would spell my end, that if I acknowledged whatever horror stalked me, it would not stop until it had dragged me screaming from the van and into the blackness forever. The third delivery on my list, a soggy, wrinkled page now barely clinging to the seat beside me, was located at the very end of this cursed road, and I could already see the faint outline of a building materializing ahead through the mist. A squat, ugly house with a roof sagging inward like a collapsed lung, its windows glowing faintly with a sickly greenish light that made my stomach churn and my skin crawl as if ants were swarming just beneath the surface. And as I drew closer, the sight of the front door, wide open, swinging lazily back and forth as though beckoning me inside, made every nerve in my body scream with raw, primal dread. I slammed the van into park several yards away, killing the engine but keeping the headlights trained on the sagging porch. And with leaden limbs, I fumbled for the package meant for this address, a small, oddly heavy box wrapped in waxy paper that left a faint, greasy residue on my hands. And as I stepped out into the freezing mist, a low voice, wet and broken, whispered my name from somewhere deep inside the house. Not shouted, not called, but whispered, tender and vile, like a lover dragging their nails across my mind. Rule 2 surged through my panic-flooded mind. Place the package on the doorstep, knock exactly 3 times, and leave immediately without stepping inside, no matter what you hear. And with my heart hammering against my ribs like a living thing trying to escape, I staggered up the uneven walkway, every footstep feeling like it might be my last. Until at last, I reached the rotted wooden steps leading up to the threshold. I kept my gaze locked on the warped boards beneath my feet, refusing to glance into the yawning darkness within the house, because some cold, instinctive part of me knew that if I even glimpsed whatever waited inside, I would never walk away from this place. So with shaking hands, I placed the greasy package carefully on the threshold, lifted my fist, and rapped 3 quick, sharp knocks against the doorframe, the sound echoing into the unnatural stillness like a gunshot. The instant the third knock sounded, a cacophony of shrieks erupted from inside. Dozens, maybe hundreds of voices howling in anguish and rage. And without waiting another second, I spun around and bolted back toward the van, my boots slipping on the wet gravel as I sprinted blindly through the swirling mist. And behind me, I heard the rapid, heavy thud of footsteps, too many to count, pounding after me in a frenzy of clawed feet and gasping breaths. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But the air grew colder and thicker with each step, as though invisible hands were clutching at my clothes, my hair, my very soul, trying to pull me down. And when I finally wrenched the van door open and threw myself inside, slamming the lock down with a trembling hand, I barely managed to jam the key into the ignition before the van rocked violently as something heavy slammed into the side. The engine groaned, the starter whining uselessly, and I squeezed my eyes shut so hard that hot tears burst from the corners, remembering Mr. Granger's warning. If the engine doesn't start, close your eyes and do not open them until you are at least 1 mile away. And so I sat there, blind and trembling, as unseen things battered the van, scraping and howling and rattling the handles with furious abandon. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, whispering broken prayers I hadn't said in years. And after what felt like an eternity, the engine roared to life beneath me, and without daring to look, I stomped the accelerator to the floor and felt the van lurch forward, tires spinning wildly before catching the broken asphalt and propelling me back down the road at a speed that should have been suicidal, but somehow wasn't fast enough. I didn't open my eyes for what felt like a lifetime, navigating by blind instinct alone, until the oppressive pressure lifted. The sounds of pursuit faded into nothingness, and the chill in the air lessened ever so slightly. And when I finally dared to peek through watering eyes, the road ahead stretched clear and empty beneath the sickly, pale light of a waning moon that seemed to be watching me with a cold, indifferent gaze. There was only one delivery left now, one final name on the list scrawled in Mr. Granger's angular handwriting, and I knew, with a dread so complete it hollowed out my insides, that whatever awaited me at the end of this last road would make everything I had survived so far seem like a mercy by comparison. The address led me deeper into the woods, down a path so narrow and overgrown that branches scraped and clawed at the sides of the van like skeletal fingers. And somewhere in the distance, a thin, high-pitched voice sang a tuneless, broken melody that made my teeth ache and my spine twitch with revulsion. And though I knew it was only another trick of this cursed night, the part of me that still remembered being a child, alone and afraid of the dark, quivered with the certainty that the song was meant for me. At last, the trees broke, and I found myself pulling up to a clearing where a single house sat, squat and foreboding, its paint peeled away by years of neglect, its windows boarded shut with rough planks, and on the battered front door, a crude symbol had been carved deep into the wood, a jagged, spiraling shape that seemed to shift and writhe if I looked at it too long. And I knew with a certainty born of primal terror that this was the final stop, the place where the night would either end or I would. I killed the engine and stared at the house, the package for this address heavy and cold in my lap, and for a long moment, I could not move, paralyzed by the knowledge that stepping out of the van meant stepping into something far worse than death, something that would not only consume my body, but erase my very existence from the world. But then, from deep within the house, a voice called out, not my name this time, but a word in a language I did not know, a word that tasted of blood and rot and madness. And before I knew it, my hand was reaching for the door handle, my body moving as though controlled by unseen strings. And the last thought that flickered through my mind before I stepped into the mist was simple, terrible, and final. There is no going back. The mist clung to me like living things, cold and slick against my skin, as I stumbled toward the house with the package pressed tight against my chest. And though my legs felt leaden, and each step was a monumental effort against the unseen weight of terror pressing down on me, I could no more stop myself from advancing than I could halt the tide of some vast and ancient ocean. The sickly glow leaking from the seams of the boarded windows growing brighter with every reluctant stride until it seemed to seep into my very pores, staining my bones with a nauseating green light. The door hung slightly ajar, groaning softly as it rocked back and forth in the damp wind, and from the darkness beyond came the sharp, irregular sound of breathing. Not one breath, not two, but a chorus of ragged, shuddering gasps, rising and falling like the lungs of something immense and slumbering just beyond the veil of sight. and though every instinct within me shrieked to turn and flee, to abandon the cursed package and the cursed house and the cursed rules that had led me here, I found myself crossing the threshold with the cautious, resigned steps of a man walking to his own execution. Inside, the air was thick and wet, smelling of mildew and coppery rot, and though the house appeared abandoned, with peeling wallpaper sagging from the walls and black mold creeping in jagged tendrils across the ceiling, there was a terrible sense of occupancy, as if the house itself were alive, watching me, breathing with me, and waiting for me to make some fatal mistake. And somewhere deep inside, I understood with bone-deep certainty that this was a place of endings, a place where the living did not belong. I placed the package on a cracked and rotting table just inside the entryway, but before I could even draw my hand back, a voice from the darkness spoke, harsh and raw, yet disturbingly familiar. And when it said my name, it did so not with affection or recognition, but with a hideous glee that made my skin crawl and my knees buckle slightly beneath me. And stepping forward from the shadows, a figure emerged, a man of impossible proportions, his body wrapped in decaying funeral cloths that dragged wetly across the warped floorboards. "Delivery," the thing rasped in a voice that gurgled like a drowning man. And when I tried to answer, to say that yes, I had delivered the package, no more, no less, my throat seized up, and no sound emerged, only a weak wheeze that earned a horrible smile from the thing as it lurched closer. Its exposed skin, blackened and cracked like old leather, stretched too tight across brittle bone. I staggered backward, nearly tripping over the broken threshold. And the rules, the sacred 5 rules Mr. Granger had drilled into me on that first cursed night, screamed inside my mind. But here, in this place, the rules seemed thin and tattered, little more than desperate prayers whispered into an uncaring void. And as the thing's long, clawed fingers reached toward me, I did the only thing I could think of. I turned and ran. The mist outside had thickened to an almost solid wall, and as I barreled blindly forward, I felt it part reluctantly around me, brushing against my face and arms with the clammy touch of corpses long dead. And somewhere in the distance, the van sat waiting, its frame barely visible through the choking fog, a fragile, flickering beacon of safety in a world that no longer obeyed sane laws. Behind me, the thing gave chase, its heavy, wet footsteps thudding against the broken ground with a dreadful inevitability. And though terror lent wings to my feet, the mist seemed to drag at me with unseen hands, slowing me, clutching at my legs, whispering blasphemous promises into my ears. And with each step, I felt the gap between us narrowing, the reeking breath of the thing growing hotter against the back of my neck. At last, gasping and half sobbing, I reached the van, fumbling wildly for the keys I had foolishly left in the ignition. And just as I wrenched the door open and dove inside, something cold and slick brushed the back of my neck, a caress so revolting that I screamed, slamming the door shut and jamming down the lock with frantic, shaking hands. And before the thing could follow, I twisted the key hard, the engine roaring to life with a deafening snarl. I punched the accelerator without hesitation, the tires screeching as they fought for purchase on the slimy ground. And as I tore away from the house, I risked one final glance in the rearview mirror, not to see the thing chasing me, no, but to confirm that the house was growing smaller, shrinking into the mist, fading away like a nightmare with the coming of dawn. But no dawn came, only thicker darkness and a road that twisted and writhed beneath me like a living thing. And as I drove, the mist swallowed everything but the narrow strip of broken asphalt ahead. And somewhere far behind, I thought I heard laughter. High, wild, and jubilant, as if the night itself had claimed its prize and was mocking me for thinking I had escaped. The van shuddered and groaned as I pressed onward, the headlights flickering and sputtering in the oppressive gloom. And when the road split again, not into 3 paths this time, but into many, an endless branching labyrinth of choices stretching into forever, I realized with a horrible, sinking certainty that the final rule had changed, that the middle path no longer existed, and that I had been abandoned in a place where rules meant nothing. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles cracked audibly, my eyes darting deadly from one darkened path to the next, but every road seemed identical. Narrow, broken, lined with skeletal trees that clawed at the sky. And no matter how hard I listened, no matter how hard I strained my senses, There were no sounds to guide me, no flickering lights to tempt me, only endless silence and the oppressive weight of unseen eyes watching from the void. The van sputtered again, the fuel gauge trembling on empty, and with no other choice, I chose a path at random, turning the wheel sharply and plunging into the darkness, the tires bumping and jostling over unseen obstacles. And as I drove deeper into the heart of the mist, I realized with a bleak, crushing finality that I was no longer delivering packages. I was the package now, being delivered to something that had been waiting for me all along. And somewhere, far ahead, where the mist thickened into a wall of black, a figure stood waiting in the center of the road. A tall, thin man with a burlap sack over his head, waving frantically, screaming soundlessly for me to stop. And though I knew, oh God, I knew what the first rule had said, my foot betrayed me, easing off the accelerator, my hands trembling on the wheel as the van began to slow. The figure staggered forward, its hands reaching out, and in the final hopeless seconds before everything went dark, I understood the terrible, inescapable truth. There had never been a way out, only the illusion of choice, and the rules had never been meant to save me, only to buy me enough time to deliver myself to whatever waited beyond the last road. The van stuttered to a halt, the engine dying with a final, shuddering cough, and as the figure reached for me, the mist closed in, swallowing me whole.